finding myself, I was around 11, 12 years old when I began to put lyrics together. Even after it happened, I guess the first thing set in was, this is a crisis. The important thing is that I don't allow myself to die.
On behalf of all musicians gathered here on stage and in the audience, we want to thank you for the lasting soul and the deep beauty of the music that you made. You've been an inspiration to all of us, and we're just honored to be up here with you tonight.
Curtis Mayfield died at 57, and what happened in those final years will break your heart. But the truth about his death reveals something far more powerful than tragedy. It shows us a man who turned unimaginable suffering into art, who sang from a hospital bed when he could barely breathe, and who proved that the human spirit can triumph over anything. This is the real story of Curtis Mayfield's final chapter. Most people remember Curtis Mayfield for the glory days. They think of Superfly, the #1 albums, the sold-out concerts, but by 1980, that world was crumbling. Mayfield had built something rare in the music industry. He owned his masters, he controlled his publishing. His label, Curtin Records, was supposed to be the Chicago Motown, a place where black artists could build wealth and independence. For a while, it worked beautifully. Then everything changed. The music industry shifted under his feet. Disco took over, and suddenly, the soulful, guitar-driven sound that made Mayfield famous felt old-fashioned. He tried to adapt. He released albums like Do It All Night and Heartbeat, attempting to ride the disco wave, but critics saw through it. The albums felt forced, like watching a poet try to write advertising jingle. The magic wasn't there. Mayfield made a gamble on film. After Superfly sold 12 million copies and became bigger than the movie itself, he thought soundtracks could save him. He poured money into Short Eyes, a prison drama that should have been his next triumph. Instead, it bombed. The public wanted Star Wars and Saturday Night Fever, not gritty stories about life behind bars. The financial losses were devastating. One by one, Curtin's other soundtrack projects failed. The money dried up. By 1980, Mayfield had to face reality. He closed the Curtin offices in Chicago and moved his family to Atlanta. It wasn't a triumphant relocation. It was a retreat. The dream of building a black-owned empire had collapsed. The closure of Curtin, followed quickly by Brunswick Records shutting down their Chicago office, essentially ended the city's soul music infrastructure. An entire era died. Mayfield went from being a mogul to being a working musician again, taking whatever gigs he could find to pay the bills. The transition was humbling for someone who had once dreamed of being as wealthy as Berry Gordy. He later admitted that it just wasn't in the cards for one man to run a publishing company, be a recording artist, and be a producer all at once. The 1980s were his wilderness years. He signed with Boardwalk Records and tried to modernize his sound. They paired him with producers who specialized in pop disco. The result was Love Is the Place, an album that confused his longtime fans without winning new ones. One single made it to number 15 on the soul charts, but that was it. His next albums performed worse. Honesty peaked at number 49. We Come in Peace with a Message of Love barely registered at number 84. Mayfield spent the decade touring constantly, especially in Europe and Japan, where audiences still revered him. But back home in America, he was becoming an oldies act. The man who had soundtracked the civil rights movement was now playing nostalgia circuits. During this time, his personal life grew complicated. His first marriage fell apart amid infidelity. He had begun a relationship with a woman named Diane while still married to Helen, conducting it through secret letters and tour meetups. The divorce was messy, with Mayfield fighting over finances even as he started a new life. Those closest to him saw a different side during these years, a man whose private behavior didn't always match his public message of love and unity. But let me tell you what happened next, because this is where Curtis Mayfield's story becomes truly remarkable. By 1990, things were looking up. The return of Superfly's soundtrack brought him back into the conversation. Hip-hop artists were sampling his work, introducing him to a new generation. He had a concert booked at Wingate Field in Brooklyn on August 13th. 10,000 people were coming to see him. This could have been the beginning of a comeback. On the morning of the concert, Mayfield flew into LaGuardia Airport from Long Beach, California. Money was tight, so he stayed at a cheaper hotel in New Jersey instead of Manhattan. He arrived at the venue around 8:30 that evening and collected his performance fee up front, something legacy artists learned to do to protect themselves. The weather was getting bad. High winds were whipping through the outdoor venue, but the show had to go on. The crowd was restless. Organizers asked Mayfield to go on stage early to appease them. His band started playing the opening chorus to Superfly. Mayfield walked up the stairs to the stage wearing his guitar. That's when a massive lighting rig, destabilized by the wind, came crashing down. It struck him across the neck. He remembered nothing, not the impact, not falling, nothing. When he woke up in Kings County Hospital, Curtis Mayfield was paralyzed from the neck down. He would never walk again. He would never play guitar again. The unique tuning he had developed, inspired by the black keys of a piano, was now just a memory. His fingers would never touch those strings again. The promoters tried to call it an act of God. They fought the lawsuit, claiming the windstorm made it nobody's fault. The legal battle dragged on for years. Eventually, there was a settlement, but the amount was kept secret and the money didn't come right away. Meanwhile, Mayfield needed round-the-clock care. The medical bills were crushing. By 1993, the financial pressure was unbearable. This was Curtis Mayfield, a legend who had written People Get Ready, and he was borrowing money from BMI just to pay his nurses. He had to take advances against his future royalties to cover current expenses. He told an interviewer, "I don't wish for charity, but I must realize that I'm in need of everybody." The music industry stepped up. Warner Brothers released All Men Are Brothers, a tribute album in 1994. Bruce Springsteen, Eric Clapton, Whitney Houston, and Aretha Franklin covered his songs. The proceeds went directly to Mayfield's medical care. It was a beautiful gesture, but also a painful acknowledgement. The wealth he had built wasn't enough to handle this catastrophe. The costs of specialized equipment, physical therapy, and constant nursing care were horrendous. He needed help from everyone, and the tribute album provided some of that relief. Here's where the story gets inspiring. Most people would have given up. Most people, faced with complete paralysis, would have retreated into bitterness. Not Curtis Mayfield. He decided to make one more album. In 1996, he released New World Order, and the way he recorded it was nothing short of miraculous. Mayfield couldn't sit up. The paralysis had damaged his diaphragm, the muscle you need to sing. He couldn't project his voice anymore. He required assistance just to clear his lungs, so his team suspended him on his back in the studio. They used gravity to help compress his chest, giving him just enough air to push out sound. He recorded the vocals line by line, sometimes word by word. The process took months. Each session was exhausting, but he kept going. The album featured collaborations with hip-hop and R&B artists who grew up idolizing him. It bridged decades of music, connecting his Chicago soul roots to the neo-soul movement of the 1990s. When you listen to New World Order, you're hearing a man refusing to be defeated. You're hearing someone who chose creation over resignation. He couldn't move his body, but his mind and spirit were stronger than ever. That album is a testament to human resilience. It proves that art can flourish even in the darkest circumstances. Every note on that record represents an act of willpower, a refusal to let physical limitations silence his voice. But his body continued to fail him. The immobility led to type 2 diabetes. In February 1998, complications from the disease forced doctors to amputate his right leg. This was almost too much. The amputation broke his remaining reserves. When the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted him as a solo artist in March 1999, Curtis Mayfield was too sick to attend. The man who had given so much to music couldn't even accept the honor in person. On December 26, 1999, Curtis Mayfield died in Roswell, Georgia. The cause was complications from diabetes. He was 57 years old. His death should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. After he died, a vicious legal battle erupted over his estate. Mayfield had been married to Althida for over 20 years. He left behind 10 children from various relationships. He had appointed his longtime manager, Marv Hyman, as executor of his will and trustee of the family trust. By 2003, Al-Thada was suing Hyman in Atlanta probate court. The allegations were shocking. She claimed Hyman had drained millions from the estate, over $350,000 in office expenses, over $500,000 in management fees. All of this in just 4 years after Mayfield's death. The worst allegation involved conflicts of interest. Hyman had allegedly invested Al-Thada's funds into a small Florida company called Metropolitan Health Networks, where Hyman himself was a director and his relatives were shareholders. He was gambling with the estate's money for his own benefit. The legal fights dragged on for years. Mayfield's older children, including Curtis Mayfield III, fought over understanding securitization, a scheme where future royalties get sold for immediate cash. The family fractured. The estate that should have been Mayfield's legacy became a battleground. The man who had sung about unity and love left behind chaos and litigation. But here's what matters. Here's what we should remember about Curtis Mayfield's death in his final years. Yes, there was tragedy. Yes, there was suffering. Yes, his body failed him in the cruelest ways. And yes, people fought over his money after he was gone. But that's not the truth about his death. The truth is that Curtis Mayfield showed us how to face the unimaginable. He showed us that creativity doesn't need a healthy body. It needs a determined spirit. When he was lying on his back, barely able to breathe, he made music. When doctors told him what he lost, he focused on what remained. When the world expected him to fade away, he released an album that still moves people today. Curtis Mayfield spent his career singing about hope and perseverance. People Get Ready became an anthem because it promised that even in the darkest times, change was coming. Even when you couldn't see the way forward, you had to keep faith. In his final decade, he lived those lyrics. He got ready. He kept moving forward even when his body wouldn't. He kept creating even when it seemed impossible. The man who wrote the soundtrack to the civil rights movement wrote one final soundtrack in his last years. It was the soundtrack to dignity. It was the soundtrack to refusing to quit. It was the soundtrack to choosing art over despair. Think about what that means for a moment. Imagine losing everything physical, your ability to walk, to move your arms, to play the instrument that defined you. Imagine needing help to breathe properly. Most of us would crumble. We let depression swallow us whole. We decide that life without those abilities wasn't worth living. Mayfield looked at that same situation and saw opportunity. He saw a challenge. He asked himself how he could still make music, not if he could. That mindset changed everything. It transformed tragedy into purpose. It gave him a reason to wake up every morning despite the pain and limitation. The recording of New World Order wasn't just about making one more album. It was about proving something fundamental about human nature. It was about demonstrating that our essence, our creativity, our ability to contribute something beautiful to the world doesn't live in our muscles or our mobility. It lives in our minds and our spirits. Mayfield's body was broken, but his artistry remained intact. His voice was weakened, but his message was stronger than ever. He showed every person facing disability or illness that their worth doesn't diminish when their physical capabilities do. When we talk about how Curtis Mayfield died, we should talk about the stage accident. We should talk about the paralysis and the diabetes and the amputation. Those facts matter, but we should talk even more about the 9 years he lived after that lighting rig fell. We should talk about the line-by-line recording session. We should talk about the tribute albums organized by fellow musicians who loved him. We should talk about the way he told interviewers that he didn't wish for charity, but he knew he needed help, and he wasn't ashamed to say it. That's courage. That's humanity. His influence didn't die with him. Modern artists still sample his work. His songs still play at protests and celebrations. When people march for justice, they still sing People Get Ready. When musicians talk about owning their masters and controlling their publishing, they're walking a path Curtis Mayfield tried to clear. He didn't succeed in building the empire he dreamed of, but he showed it was possible to try. He proved that Black artists could demand ownership and respect. The legal battles after his death proved how valuable his catalog remained. People fought over it because it was worth fighting for. That's its own kind of legacy. Curtis Mayfield died at 57, but he packed more artistry and courage into those final 9 paralyzed years than most people manage in a full lifetime. The truth about his death isn't the tragedy. The truth is the triumph. The truth is that he turned a hospital bed into a recording studio. He turned gravity into a tool. He turned limitation into inspiration. He sang when singing should have been impossible. He created when creation should have been beyond reach. That's who Curtis Mayfield was. Not just a gentle genius, not just the voice of a generation, but a man who showed us that the human spirit can transcend any physical cage. So yes, Curtis Mayfield died at 57, but before he died, he taught us how to live. He taught us that your circumstances don't define your choices. He taught us that art is stronger than pain. He taught us that you can lose everything except your determination to create. The lightning rig took his mobility, diabetes took his leg, time took his life, but nothing took his music, nothing took his legacy, nothing took the example he set for everyone who faces the impossible and chooses to keep going anyway. That's the truth about Curtis Mayfield's death. It's a story about life. It's a story about what we're capable of when we refuse to surrender, and that story will inspire people for generations to come. His final years weren't about dying. They were about living with purpose until the very end.